Today's webinar, we're going to be talking about ESG litigation and reputation management. But before I introduce the speakers, just a couple of housekeeping points. We're scheduled for 90 minutes today, which is quite punchy for a webinar, but we're going to try and keep the session as interactive as possible. So we're going to try and take up no more than an hour of that. We're going to leave plenty of time to discuss any questions or issues that you want to raise. So if you want to do that, please feel free to submit any comments using the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen. You can do that throughout the webinar, and then we will pick them up either as we go through the session today or at the end when there should be plenty of time left for questions. The other point to note is that today's session is the second webinar in a series that's being run by the Sherton and Wedderburn Environmental, Social and Governance Advisory Group. That's got different specialist lawyers and some brilliant guest speakers covering specific issues related to ESG. So if you want to sign up for any of the upcoming webinars or view a recording of the first webinar in the series, which was a couple of weeks back and looked at the top 5 ESG issues that are facing businesses and how to develop an effective strategy to address them, then you can follow the links that are going to be posted in the chat now. By way of introduction, my name is Phillip. I'm a partner in the Commercial Disputes and Regulation team at Sherton and Wedderburn, and I advise clients on a range of commercial disputes and help them to manage the reputational risks that come with that. I've also acted on both the claimant and the defendant side in group litigation, which is also known as class actions, and they're also a common feature of ESG claims north and south of the border. I'm also absolutely delighted to be joined today by two speakers who I think should be able to provide a really unique perspective on this issue. First is Jack Naylor, who is the Chief Investment Officer and Head of Origination and Litigation Strategy at Aristata Capital. Aristata was founded in 2018, and it's the first litigation funder that's dedicated to driving positive social and environmental change by funding litigation that achieves a measurable social and environmental impact. Prior to joining Aristata, Jack was formerly a lawyer at Freshfields and head of litigation for PwC. Also joining me is Andy Maciver, friend of the pod. Andy is a co-founder of Message Matters, a PR and lobbying consultancy. He's got over 20 years experience of strategic communications in political campaigns and also in professional services PR, and that's been helped by long-standing relationships across the political spectrum and throughout the media. He's also a regular political commentator on the BBC and STV and in the press. So just to set the scene for today, and as with all things ESG, often when it comes to disputes, they can quite quickly focus in on environmental litigation and some of the claims that relate to the impact of climate change. That's obviously understandable, given that they tend to dominate the headlines. But today what we're going to try to do is take a step back and look at some of the risks and claims that are associated with ESG more broadly. And I'm really keen to make sure that we get the benefit of Jack and Andy's insights into some of these issues. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do is kick us off by trying to summarise what it is that we mean by ESG claims, try to explain some of the reasons why there's been such a marked increase in the number of them in recent years, and then probably look at a couple of recent examples in the UK that highlight some of the trends and where we see this going in the next few years. Jack's then going to talk more specifically about litigation funding in this area. That's been one of the really game-changing developments over the past few years, and the impact that it's had has enabled individuals, groups of claimants to take action in circumstances where previously they might not have been able to. And then finally, Andy is going to discuss some of the ways to manage and minimise the risk of being subject to this type of claim, and also think about some of the steps an organisation can take to try to ensure that it's well prepared to respond to an issue when it does arise. So we're really trying to cover a wide range today, and if there are any specific issues that you want to flag, like I say, just throw them into the question and answer function and we'll pick them up at the end as well. So kicking off and trying to quickly walk through the development of ESG claims. Broadly, trying to define ESG and trying to define the claims that come out of the back of them is very difficult, but it's really any claim that, as we see it, tries to, as one of its main objectives, have an impact on a specific environmental or social issue. It's important to keep in mind that this needs to be viewed in the round, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that there's a specific court order that's being sought in the claim itself. So some claims will seek an order that requires an organisation to take or not take a particular course of action, but they'll also often look to recover damages for something that's already happened. And in doing so, what they'll try to do is apply financial and reputational pressure to that organisation in the hope that that in turn drives the behavioural change and has the impact that's desired. That's not a new concept. And when you think about, for example, the civil rights claims that were brought by organisations like the NAACP at the turn of the 20th century in the US, there's lots of examples of these types of claims being brought throughout history in order to try to effect change. But as ESG has become an increasingly well understood concept, particularly over the course of the last decade, and it's become more of a standard measurement for determining the sustainability of an organisation's business practices, it's also become quite a convenient umbrella term for all these types of claims. It's clear that these claims are continuing to rise year on year. The London School of Economics recently released a report on the global trends in climate litigation, so just focusing on climate litigation, but it reports a doubling in the number of claims that have been commenced worldwide in the last 7 years. And whilst the vast majority at the moment at least are in the US, the rate of claims that are being brought in other jurisdictions are now increasing more quickly. And outside of the US, two of the main jurisdictions where you're seeing the increase in these volume of claims are the UK and also in Australia. We'll come on to some of the reasons why that might be the case in a minute. And I think there are a number of very complicated factors at play behind this. Broadly, trying to think about it, I can almost see them in three specific groups. So what you have is probably first, and perhaps most obviously, there's just been a general increase in public awareness of these issues over the last decade. Climate change and social injustice or inequality regularly poll as the top challenges that are facing society, both at a UK level and also at a global level. And that increased awareness of the challenges has also seen a corresponding increase in the use of litigation as a tool for charities or non-profits to try to drive change. So in the UK, you've got organisations like the Good Law Project, whose stated aim is to use the law to create, as they describe it, a better, fairer and greener future for the UK. And what they do is they use the legal system combined with very effective marketing and PR in order to highlight specific areas of concern through litigation and other means. And Andy's going to come on to look at some of those reputational issues that accompany these types of claims later on. But for now, the main point to note is that because these claims are really intended to draw public attention to a particular issue, they in turn also raise awareness of the fact that litigation can be a really effective tool for bringing around that type of change. The second factor is a gradual but definitely marked increase in the regulatory landscape that enables regulators to take action to hold individuals and organisations to account for claims that are made about ESG credentials and the steps that they're taking. So previously, where many ESG principles were principally viewed by organisations perhaps as marketing puff, we're now starting to see a shift towards binding commitments that are accompanied by genuine sanctions for non-compliance. You can see that in a number of areas. So in anti-bribery and corruption, modern slavery and data protection, the changes to legislation over the last 10, 15 years have all introduced a much more rigorous obligation on organisations, and regulators are also able to impose quite significant fines and in extreme cases criminal sanctions on the directors for corporate misconduct. And so these principles really start to have some teeth. One of the areas that's possibly been lagging behind, but again there's reform on the way, is in consumer protection legislation, which covers advertising by organisations in relation to their ESG credentials. So historically, that's been quite an inconsistent and largely ineffective enforcement regime because it's been governed by a number of different statutes and because there are various different individual entities involved in enforcing them. But the idea behind the government's Digital Markets, Competition and Consumer Bill is to promote enforcement powers for the CMA to investigate and enforce potential breaches of consumer protection law. So that's going to include monetary penalties of up to £300,000 or 10% of global turnover if higher, People who are familiar with data protection legislation will recognise the theme. And what that will hopefully represent is a real step change in the way that issues like greenwashing can be addressed. The third and final fact that I think contributes to the rise in ESG claims is more structural and really relates to the way that litigation can be conducted in the UK. Recent changes have removed a number of the hurdles that would historically have made it very difficult for some of these claims to get off the ground. One of the major ones that Jack's going to cover in a moment is the development of litigation funding, and specifically litigation funding for these types of claims. But the other one more generally is the evolution of the rules for group litigation in the UK. So together, these two developments have had a huge impact on the ability of parties to get their ESG themed claims off the ground, whilst trying to manage a number of the really significant risks that exist within litigation. In terms of the process itself, group litigation has been around for some time in England and Wales. It was originally proposed as part of the Wolf reforms in 1996. And since then, it's continued to develop and grow, and it generally follows what's called an opt-in model. And what this does is allows individuals to actively choose to join an action and become a member of a class of litigants. That process is then controlled by a number of procedural rules, and the approvals that need to be met before the group action is allowed to proceed are regulated by the court to try to sift out some of the more unmeritorious claims before significant costs incurred. That's a really different approach to the approach that's generally taken in the US, where group litigation is typically conducted on an opt-out model. In that system, what happens is one party will bring a claim on behalf of a defined class of litigants, and unless someone actively chooses to leave the litigation, they're automatically considered a part of it. So coming back to the split of numbers in relation to claims for climate litigation, that's perhaps part of the reason why so many of these claims, historically at least, have been taking place in the US, where you've got that opt-out model in place. In England, there are certain circumstances where the opt-out model is applicable. There are currently two. The first is the representative action procedure, where a party basically brings a claim as a representative of a group of litigants who have the same interest in a similar way to the US. And the second is a collective redress regime that's been set up for competition claims, and that was introduced in 2015 and provides the same opt-out regime for damages in relation to breaches arising from competition law. Those mechanisms have been hugely important in the growth of ESG litigation more generally. In comparison to England, the group litigation procedure in Scotland is relatively new. It was only introduced and came into force in July 2020. And prior to this, the group litigation was possible, but because as there was a lack of dedicated procedural rules, it quickly became incredibly challenging and expensive to bring a claim. At the moment, you can only deal with Scottish claims on an opt-in basis, so you need each individual claimant to give their permission to join the group. And it'll probably take some time for that to wash through in terms of how that's going to work in practice. Before handing over to Jack, I thought it was probably useful to try to bring some of those issues to life through recent cases that are currently working their way through the courts. There's a number of trends in ESG litigation that I think are coming out, and it's important for you to try to be aware of them because you can see the way that things are moving, particularly through some of the cases in the English courts. The first, as I see it, is a change in tactic towards derivative claims, so claims that are based on a breach of a director's statutory duties under the Companies Act. These claims are really not straightforward, and similar to a group litigation, they require the permission of a court to proceed to a full hearing. And to be honest, so far they've had pretty limited success. But the thing to watch is that if they do start to make progress, I think they're going to be highly impactful because they would see the directors as individuals being the defendants to any claim rather than the company itself. So to give you a couple of recent examples of them, in 2021, there was a derivative claim that was raised by two university lecturers. They brought the claim against the directors of their pension fund, the university's superannuation scheme. The action included claims that the directors of the fund had failed in their duties to the company by investing in fossil fuels. So again, permission to bring that derivative action was originally refused in May 2022, but that was then successfully appealed, and a hearing is due to take place later this month. Also in February this year, a similar set of proceedings were issued by the charity Client Earth against the directors of Shell in the English High Court. Client Earth's press release explained that Shell, it alleged that Shell's 11 directors had breached their legal duties under the Companies Act by failing to adopt and implement an energy transition strategy that aligned with the Paris Agreement. Importantly for this one, I think it's really interesting because Client Earth has received significant institutional support from some investors, and they collectively hold more than 12 million shares in Shell. So that includes UK pension funds, Nest and London CIV. And last month, Client Earth was also refused permission to proceed by the High Court, and an oral hearing is now going to take place where Client Earth are going to try to persuade the judge to reconsider that decision. Obviously, they need to get through that initial gateway, but if either of them make it past that permission stage, then I think it's likely that they're going to receive some really significant press attention. So it's worth looking out for those decisions. The second example that I think sort of brings to life some of the issues around ESG litigation, and particularly in relation to group litigation and how that changes the economics of a claim, is actually a Scottish claim, and it's a group litigation that's been brought by over 1,300 former and current employees of a Scottish company, James Finlay Kenya Limited. They're seeking damages from the company, alleging that they suffered musculoskeletal injuries whilst they were working for the company at its farms in the Kericho region of Kenya. It's also reported that there are currently over 2,000 other workers who are prepared to commence similar claims depending on how this litigation progresses. And this is a really good example of a case where it's almost certainly unlikely to be economically viable for individual workers who, as I understand, are seeking around £15,000 each to bring a claim in Scotland. But when you've got an entire class of around 1,300 coming together, suddenly the headline value of that claim increases to around £20 million. The financial metrics immediately change, and suddenly the claim becomes a lot more straightforward in terms of the economics and making that claim stack up. It's also a useful example because it shows some of the challenges with these types of claims. It's progressed very, very slowly through the Scottish courts, with the company originally successfully obtaining a temporary injunction from the Kenyan court to prevent the claim progressing in Scotland. The claimants then had to bring further proceedings in the Scottish court to get them to grant an anti-suit injunction so that the company would then be required to apply to the Kenyan court to have the order lifted. And now there needs to be another hearing on whether the Scottish court even has jurisdiction in the first place so that it can proceed to trial in Scotland. So before you even get to the stage of a substantive hearing, there are a number of procedural steps that have been taken. And this isn't uncommon in this type of litigation, where a common tactic for a defendant is to try to slow the pace of these as much as possible, get it into a very protracted litigation, which comes to the question of costs, which is probably the ideal point for me to hand over to Jack, because once this stuff becomes entrenched, and one of the major issues claimants have is understanding how they're going to deal with the cost of the litigation, it introduces a number of additional questions. So I guess, Jack, from my perspective, I think it'd be really useful if you were able to explain, probably at a high level, what litigation funding is more generally, and then also what Aristata and others in this space are trying to do in relation to claims with an ESG impact.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me to take part today. Just to, at a very high level, for those that are not familiar with litigation funding, what is it? Well, in simple terms, it's when a third-party funder provides finance on a non-recourse basis to a claimant or its law firm to cover the costs of the litigation in exchange for the return of the funder's capital and an agreed return, which is usually either on the basis of a multiple of the costs incurred or a percentage of the recovery achieved. So this enables the funded party both to finance the costs of its own claim and to manage any adverse cost risk, assuming the claim is in a jurisdiction where the loser has to pay the winner's costs. So that is common in most common law jurisdictions outside of the US, where generally there is not a loser pays winner's costs regime. there's a whole variety of different structures that can be used for different types of claim, whether they are litigation, arbitration, enforcement proceedings, asset recovery proceedings, or any other type of claim, depending on what is most suitable to the particular situation. So a funder may directly fund the claimant with a funding agreement between funder and claimant. It may agree to fund just law firm costs, operating costs, or disbursements. That tends to be an agreement between funder and law firm. And so there's a whole variety of structures that can be used. Traditional litigation funders tend to focus on what is the maximum return that they can achieve on their invested capital. Now, there's nothing strange or unusual about that, but what that can do is produce tensions between the funder and the claimant and or its law firm, particularly in the situation that often happens in pieces of litigation, where costs rise, the recovery that can be achieved reduces, and the timescale extends, placing pressure on that relationship. Now, my business, Aristata Capital, is, so far as we're aware, the world's first impact litigation funder. So we have been set up to use law to create systemic change and equalize some of those power dynamics between claimants who are often not able to fund their own claims and defendants who may well be well financed and able to deal with or push away those claims. So what we're trying to do is protect the environment, protect social justice and communities by providing them with the ability to bring good, meritorious legal claims, not speculative actions. So we're trying to fill that gap, which Matt mentioned, between pure public interest litigation, the sort of thing that Client Earth tend to do very well, which at its simplest is requiring often governments or public bodies to comply with their own rules, laws, and regulation. So that often involves judicial review or injunctive relief, but rarely ever involves seeking compensation for those who have been affected by whatever that breach is. So what we're trying to do is to fund meritorious commercial cases in order to compensate those who've been affected, and most importantly, to change behavior, and where we can, set precedents that others can follow by improving access to justice and encouraging whoever the defendants might be to take responsibility for their actions and whatever the damage is that they have caused. So in that sense, we are set up to be a catalyst for positive change. So Aristata funds impactful commercial litigation, claims where our funding can generate both positive and measurable social or environmental impact and a reasonable, flexible return based on the nature of the claimant or claimants, the type of claim, and the overall circumstances. So because of that very important impact piece, we are well aligned with the interests of the claimants, because not only are we trying to help them financially, we're trying to generate those additional impact benefits. We're flexible on how we price based on the circumstances of the situation. We're open and transparent with those claimants as to what that pricing looks like. So at any level of successful recovery, the claimants and their law firm know upfront what they will receive. And we source and originate potential claims on a global basis. So how do we assess impact? Well, in a high-level sense, we look at three levers. Direct impact, which is what is the harm, what is the effect on the claimant of the defendant's actions, whether that claimant is an individual, a group, or some other form of entity, and the significance of that harm to the environment, to communities, and to the world in general. We then look at indirect impact. So if a successful outcome can be achieved on one claim, can that be scaled or replicated, whether by Aristata or by another funder or entity, to help to generate increased and scalable impact? And lastly, the sort of holy grail is induced impact, which, if one defendant can be required to take responsibility for its actions, can that lead to wider behavior change by the defendant, the sector they operate in, the industry, or others who see A has been held to account, I'm going to change the way I operate before I'm held to account. Now that can be difficult to achieve, but it's great when it is. Aristata is only a small fund. We have at present about £40 million of capital under management. So we focus on helping claimants to achieve these successful outcomes by trying to level that financial disparity that I mentioned that affects many impact type claims. So we are helping generally poorly funded claimants who cannot access legal advice and bring their claim, who may be wanting to take on well-resourced defendants who can otherwise avoid accountability or possibly settle a meritorious claim for a few pence in the pound. So just to give you a couple of examples of what that means, the first case that we funded, which was in Australia, involved 3,000 low-paid workers who were not being paid their minimum contractual entitlement by their employers. So those low-paid workers individually were not able to bring an action to recover what they were entitled to. So we helped by funding their law firm's working capital requirements so that that law firm could take those proceedings to successful settlements. As Matt mentioned earlier, these were group actions in Australia, and that settlement has to be approved by the court. So with our funding, each of those, there were 5 separate actions, was successfully completed. The workers received 100% of what they were contractually entitled to, and our return was paid out of the cost recoveries made from the defendant to the law firm, not from taking part of the worker compensation. So that is a case that is impactful on its face because of the direct benefit to the claimants. Just to give you another example, we're also currently funding a local council who represent the interests of a remote island group, and the council has a shipping contract with a shipping company to supply these islands. Perfectly straightforward, rather dry commercial breach of contract claim. The council is owed about $40 million, which it came to us saying, we can't fund this claim. If you can help us and we can recover our money, we will then be able to build more houses, more hospitals, more schools, more sea defences to improve the lives of the communities on these remote islands. So in that sense, the impact comes from the surrounding circumstances of the claim and what would happen with any recovery. Council can't fund the claim itself, we're helping them to do it, particularly because the shipping company admits that it's in breach of the contract, knows that the council don't have the information to be able to quantify their claim, and has basically been playing them along for the last 3 or 4 years. So we are helping to bring that situation to a head and hopefully to a successful conclusion for the council. One other example that we're looking at the moment involves helping an online business against a big tech company. That big tech company has already been found to have abused its dominant position in a particular market. And the impact of that abuse was that the claimant was put into bankruptcy. So what we are looking to do is to help the owners of that business, which was closed down due to this abuse of the big tech company's dominant position, and enable them, firstly, to obtain some compensation, hopefully to get back on their feet, and ideally ensure that the big tech company thinks about its behavior and changes that going forwards in the future. So that's more in the governance space rather than the environmental or social. One of the most interesting cases in this area, which was prior to us getting going, involved 15,000 Indonesian seaweed farmers whose seaweed was destroyed by a leak from an uncapped Australian oil well. Now, this claim finished relatively recently. It was funded by another funder, purely because of the commercial aspects of the claim. But the seaweed farmers were able to successfully settle the action, and the oil company has compensated them and is paying to remedy the damage that was done to the environment by oil leaking from their well. So what does funding do in the sense of shaping ESG claims? Well, funding can provide a critical resource to claimants who cannot finance their own claims in order to help to hold defendants to account and fill that justice gap that I mentioned. ESG has obviously become a very widely used label, which means quite a number of different things to different people. But most agree that there is a need to solve a range of harms that affect the global community, including climate change, other environmental change, social injustice, human rights abuses, greenwashing in all its guises, discrimination, trust in corporate behavior, and shareholder rights issues. When we at Aristata talk about we tend to talk about impact rather than ESG, because we're focused on what can be achieved for those claimants in those environmental, social, or governance areas. And funding makes good, strong legal claims accessible. It helps to level the playing field between an under-resourced claimant and a well-resourced defendant. And when successful, it helps to solve important ESG issues which otherwise may go unremedied. Responsibility for climate change, say, is a hot topic at the moment. Matt mentioned a variety of ESG cases that are going on, but in the climate change space, we often get asked, could you have just a climate fund? To which the answer is yes, but the timing is probably not right. There are a lot of interesting cases going on, claims against RWE, the German power generator, by Peruvian farmers in Germany for the effects caused by RWE on their farms in Peru. Claims by cities and states in the US against big US oil companies. Claims by the people of the Torres Strait Islands against the Australian government for their failure to live up to their climate obligations. But in the climate space, attribution science, i.e. attributing fault to those particular defendants, is moving fast but has some way to go. And as Matt mentioned in relation to the cases he mentions, there are some difficult hurdles with firstly jurisdiction, then causation, then loss that still need to be overcome. So very interesting and challenging times for a funder. And as I mentioned, the holy grail is really trying to ensure behavior change on top of the direct and indirect impact that we're seeking to achieve. There was an excellent article in the Financial Times last week, which is called "The Money Behind the Coming Wave of Climate Litigation." And if anybody wants a quick overview, it's a very good place to start.
Thanks, Jack. And I think given the coming wave of climate litigation and other forms of litigation, it's obviously a really interesting issue for corporates and other businesses to think about at the moment. And Andy, I guess from your perspective, having gone through some of the challenges that already exist and some of the changes that seem likely to increase the likelihood of these claims coming down the track, one of the things that I guess everyone is interested in hearing more about is how do you actually go about managing these issues? So from a a PR perspective and from a governance perspective, what do you do to try to stop these issues from arising in the first place, given that there's a huge range of potential claims that may exist? And when they do arise, how do you try to manage the reputational impact that these claims inevitably have?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Jack. Really interesting, all of this agenda, actually. And I think that it's exactly as you said there, Matt. The key thing is to understand that there are ways to minimise the risk and to maximise the chance of avoiding this sort of situation, but it may not always be possible, irrespective of how much an organisation does and how hard they try to be on the right side of all of it. It's a complex area. And they may work in an industry which is at a level of controversy where they actually just find it difficult to avoid attracting this sort of attention anyway, even if they go to the ends of the earth to make sure that they don't. I'll talk a little bit about how we might encourage people to avoid getting into that situation in the first place, and then move on to talking about what to do if indeed they do find themselves in the middle of a crisis. Obviously, with my background, with a particular focus on the communications behind that and how that might get dealt with in a crisis comms situation. I suppose the first thing is that there has to be a base level understanding that there's no way out of understanding and integrating ESG into business. We're no longer in a phase where you can look at it as being a nice to do or an option. Everybody has to do this now. Whether they agree with it, whether they like it, it doesn't really matter. It is now a business imperative to integrate ESG strategy into everything that they're doing. The E part of that, the environmental part, is the bit that probably still attracts most attention. Creating a credible net zero strategy and delivering that credible net zero strategy, ensuring that it meets all regulatory standards, ensuring that it covers scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, is all very important to look credible in that space. And again, I think it's actually about doing more than you think you might have to do, trying to future-proof yourself and move beyond what you think is the minimum requirement to actually try to create some sort of competitive advantage as a result of doing it, improving your investment opportunity as a result, improving your stakeholder relations, reducing the chance all the time of encountering the sort of problems that we've been talking about. And then, of course, the S and the G parts of ESG, social and governance, in some ways more complex, more complicated, and probably less publicly obvious. But actually often the ones that organisations will find themselves getting in the most trouble as a result of. So understanding what this means, understanding what social and governance means, understanding what fits into the bracket of good ESG and poor ESG is really important. And it's really an investment decision. I think that's one of the key points to get across. This should not any longer be seen as a cost. It should be seen as an investment, because it is highly unlikely that the amount of money that any organisation spends on ESG will be greater than the amount of money required to bail yourself out of a problem as a result of poor ESG. That will almost always be more costly than the cost of the initial investment in the first place. Now, we do the other side. Many people on this call, especially those from Shepherd and Wedderburn, will know me from, I suppose, more of the political sphere and Message Matters and the work that we do there, and the work that I do in political commentary. But actually, the other side of our business is Zero Matters, which is a relatively new brand, which footprints and plans and then delivers net zero strategies. And it's an interesting, very interesting set of discussions we've had on that over the last couple of years. We operate at a slightly lower end of the market than many people in this call will. We're in the SME side of things, but it's very interesting to reflect on how many people within those businesses think. And investing in ESG, I think it's only fair to recognise, is actually a very substantial business decision to take. It can have a pretty negative short-term impact on the bottom line in a lot of these SMEs. It can mean that you don't invest, for example, in stock, or you don't invest in your real estate, It might mean that you don't invest in staff or in staff bonuses, because you have to instead fund what you're doing in ESG. So in these smaller organisations, it's a very meaningful decision to take. But what we are being clear with them on is that actually, if they don't take that investment decision now, then in 10 years' time, they will probably struggle to get staff, because staff themselves will be much more discerning about who they work for based on the ESG of the organisation they're looking to work for. They will really struggle to get onto a corporate supply chain, and they'll really struggle to get onto a public sector roster. So that is true of SMEs, but these arguments can be true all the way up the chain as well. It is not just at the lower end of the scale. For those who wonder why I've been plunged into darkness, I'm doing this from the Hollywood Hotel in Edinburgh, next to Parliament, and they've put the lights off. However, I have the light of my phone, and hopefully everybody can still see me, and perhaps more importantly, can still hear me. So I'm good to keep going if everybody else is. Now, all of that being said, with the need to invest in this, and the fact that that can undoubtedly mitigate some of the problems that we're talking about. It doesn't happen for everybody. Matt talked earlier about Shell and Client Earth. You know, Shell could and do a huge amount in ESG. A lot of people would argue, of course, not enough, but they do invest a lot in that. But because of the nature of the business that they're in the business of fossil fuels. They're a very controversial global company, and it will be very difficult for a company like Shell to avoid this, irrespective of the mitigating circumstances and irrespective of what they try to do to make sure they don't get into it. So some organisations will find themselves in a difficulty. It may not go as far as litigation, but they may at least find themselves in some sort of PR difficulty, ranging from a local PR difficulty to something that's global and sustained in nature. And there are pretty basic rules about how you deal with that to make it better. You can't make these things go away, but you can certainly make it better. And there are 2 or 3 rules of crisis comms, which I'll outline, and then I'll maybe finish off by giving a few examples of good and bad crisis comms, not necessarily from the legal sector or involving litigation, but just examples of how you go about crisis comms well and how you can do the opposite and go about it badly. I think the first rule of crisis comms, especially in the modern era, is that there are no secrets. That's not just true of ESG, it's true of everything. There are no secrets in a crisis. The world is much smaller and much faster than it used to be. Somebody will always find the thing that you don't want them to find. So everybody who is involved in a crisis within an organisation, those who are making decisions and those who are advising on the decisions, you need to operate a policy of absolute full disclosure within that organisation. The people who are advising you need to know what they're dealing with. You can't hide anything from them, or it will almost undoubtedly make the crisis worse. It's inevitable that when you are attacked and when things come your way that you don't want, you will try to give as little information as you can. You'll try just to get over the hurdle in front of you. Actually, you need to look at the hurdle 10 in front of you and make sure that you're armed with all the information you need to make the right decisions. So that's the first thing. No secrets in a crisis. Always understand what you're dealing with. And to the people who are advising you, absolute full disclosure so that they can come up with the best strategy to help you manage your way through it. The second rule of crisis comms is to take external advice. So many of you will work in companies where you have excellent internal strategists and internal people who are clever and experienced and all of that. But actually, it doesn't matter, because when you are in the bunker, when you're in an organisation who's facing this sort of situation, you have to have external eyes on it as well. You need to have those trusted people who are semi-detached and on the outside to say to you, actually, hold on, this is not the right way to go. Have you thought about this? Think about this from their perspective, and so on and so on. As I say, it doesn't matter how good you are or how good your people are. External eyes are really important to help you navigate your way through a crisis. And the third and final rule of crisis comms is never drip feed information. If you know what you're being attacked with, if you know what the media or stakeholders or whoever it is that is looking at you is going to come at you with, don't let it be drip fed out over a series of days or weeks or months. That's how you put yourself in existential risk. The best thing to do in almost all cases in crisis comms is to get everything else, to get everything out at once. Everything short of taking your entire organisation down. It's better to get it all out at once and do it in a oneer and deal with it at the same time. I'm going to give you one example from personal experience of how that works. It's nothing to do with corporate life at all. It's actually a political example from my very early days working in politics. Some of you who are my age or older and who are in and around Scotland will remember a lawyer, in fact, called David McCletchie, who was leader of the Scottish Conservative Party in the early days of the Scottish Parliament. In the days before the expenses scandal meant moats and lavish gifts at Westminster, there was an expenses scandal involving David McCletchie and taxi receipts in and around Edinburgh. I was 22 or 23 years old at the time and fairly junior. So I was involved, but not necessarily at the leading edge of making decisions. And with hindsight, it's been one of the things that's helped me most in creating a crisis comms model for my clients is that we broke every single one of these rules, every one of them. Rule number 1, which was there are no secrets, so full disclosure, that rule was broken. We didn't know everything at the start of this, and information kept coming to us mainly through the press when we actually could have found it out ourselves and dealt with it. Rule number 2, we didn't take any external advice. It was 4 of us in a room, in a bunker, making decisions based largely on emotion and desperation and not on clear thinking, logic. And we also broke rule number 3, which was the drip feed. We allowed this news to be drip fed every single week in a Sunday newspaper. It happened for about 4 months. Instead of coming all out at once, it came in bits, and it was in the end existential. David had to resign from his job, was effectively forced out on something which, with hindsight, would be considered to be a relatively minor indiscretion, which might make a couple of hundred words on page 17 of a newspaper. But because we mishandled that all the way along, that resulted in the ultimate sanction, which was his resignation. So there's a real benefit of observing these 3 rules: no secrets, external advice, and no drip feeding, because it actually might just save your job, and it might just save your company. It also might save a lot of money on lawyers, which obviously I would not necessarily advocate given the audience here, but it might just save money on lawyers as well, because you can potentially sort these things out outside of that. A couple of other case studies not related to me, which are helpful as well. I think one thing just to be aware of is we're obviously talking a lot about litigation here, but it's not always about litigation, as I mentioned. Simply, sometimes it's just simply bad PR that is the issue. So if you look, for instance, at a company like Walmart, Walmart consistently on a variety of ratings and investment websites and so on will feature very poorly in terms of their ESG ratings. So they will be, it is advised that they are a bad investment in terms of ESG. And even for a company the size of Walmart, that will begin to really, really hurt them. Now, they tend to get low ESG scores, not actually based on their environmental credentials, but based on their social and governance credentials. For example, investigations into bribery, workplace safety violations, international labour laws, the use of sweatshops. Those things which fall into the social and governance side of things are really hurting them when it comes to investors' advice in whether or not Walmart should be invested into. Not just that sector, but it's very common actually in the financial sector as well to have poor ESG ratings. Again, they usually have good environmental ratings, but issues like unusually high CEO salaries or combined CEOs and chairmen, those sorts of things can really hurt your ratings and how people advise in terms of the investment portfolio in those companies. So those are things to be aware of that aren't necessarily litigious issues, but are significant PR issues. Let me finish on a slightly more positive thing, a bit closer to home, which does have a relationship to the whole ESG agenda, but it's an example of how you can turn a crisis around and actually do rather well out of it. You all, those again who are local to Edinburgh or Scotland, will be aware of the issue with Joanna Cherry, the MP, and the Stand Comedy Club. Really interesting case from the last few months. So Joanna Cherry, for those who don't know, is an MP and also a very outspoken campaigner against the Scottish Government's gender recognition legislation, and specifically against gender self-identification. She had been asked by the Stand Comedy Club to do an event, and she agreed to do that. And subsequently, the staff at the Stands Comedy Club, who will be predominantly younger people and therefore predominantly more likely to disagree with Joanna Cherry on the issue of gender recognition, intimated to the business that they would be unprepared to staff the event. They didn't want to work that event. Now, the Stand Comedy Club will have seen very edgy performances over a long number of years, decades in fact, where some of the material would be unacceptable to some but not unacceptable to others. So it was an unusual step to take, and as a result they cancelled the event. Joanna Cherry, as well as being a pretty tenacious campaigner, is a lawyer, and took pretty early legal advice and threatened then to take the Stand Comedy Club to court. It was generally accepted that the Stand would lose out in this, and that had become the political and media presumption, was that the Stand were immediately on the back foot and that Joanna Cherry was going to win. The Stand, to their credit, understood the position that they were in. They took further legal advice, and they completely changed their position. They put out a statement which was a full public mea culpa. They had made the wrong decision. They realised their decision was unlawful. They apologised to Joanna Cherry publicly, which is what she'd asked for, and they asked her to consider putting her event back on, which she said yes to. Now, they actually managed to turn around a very difficult situation really pretty quickly. They got quite a lot of praise, even from those who were opposing them. They were thanked by Joanna Cherry and praised by Joanna Cherry for their decision. And that's just an example of where, if you take a bit of external advice, if you sit back and think, if you remove yourself from the bunker, instead of doubling down on a position which would undoubtedly have got them in a lot of trouble, they completely reversed their decision, which would have been very hard for them to do. But they are now reaping the dividends from doing that. And it's just an example in a tangentially related area where good comms and good crisis comms can really get you out of a situation which may be very costly and may even be existential to what you're trying to do. Matt, back to you.
Thanks, Andy. And that's really interesting just in terms of the wider context, and again, just bringing some of those issues to life. I guess what we're probably going to do now, we've managed to keep it to under an hour. So if anyone has any questions, we've got plenty of time to pick up any additional questions that you do have. Again, just feel free to type them in the Q&A box and we'll pick them up. One of the things that I think overlaps with it, and it relates to one of the questions that was coming in that I saw Jack had answered separately in relation to SLAP claims. One of the things that I seem to spend an inordinate amount of my time doing is trying to provide, exactly as you say, Andy, that external input and that external advice around how this should progress. And one of the obvious risks that exists in the modern age is that almost everything that you prepare, everything that you write, has to be done on an assumption that it's going to be put online and that it will be viewed without the benefit of perhaps the wider context. And you've seen numerous examples of claims from letters of claim coming in from solicitors that are then posted online. The one that always springs to my mind is Joe Lycett changing his name to Hugo Boss after they served the trademark infringement claim on a small business, and you just get that publicity and can't really predict it. SLAP litigation is a similar issue. To my mind, it's one of those areas where, for the benefit of the audience, SLAP litigation is strategic litigation against public participation. And it's almost the flip side of the ESG claim coin. So instead of a group of individuals trying to bring a claim in order to bring about change, what a SLAP claim is intended to do is to prevent someone from taking a particular course of action and to prevent that public participation. So there's been a number of high-profile examples of that recently. The one that immediately sprung to my mind was in relation to Dan Needle, who is a former tax lawyer at Clifford Chance, who runs a blog that deals with a number of different tax issues. And there was a whole issue around Nadeem Zahawi and his tax affairs. Nadeem Zahawi's lawyers issued a letter before claim requiring Dan Needle to stop publishing his blog in relation to Nadeem Zahawi's finances, and it completely backfired in the sense that the letter itself was published, that Dan is very prominent on Twitter, and an issue that otherwise was receiving some attention but not a great deal then became a national news story, and for a number of days was on the front page of the Times. And again, Since that, there's then been a whole additional discussion in relation to SLAP litigation more generally. There's been guidance issued by the Solicitors Regulation Authority as to what we as solicitors are allowed to include in our letters of claim. And it's really taken on a life of its own. And it's one of those examples of a case where it started off as something relatively minor, but because of the approach that was taken in response to it has grown arms and legs. And Jack, I don't know in terms of the question that's come in, whether there's anything from the funding side, but Andy, again, probably after that, just interested in your views around how you handle some of these issues.
Yeah, just quickly on the funding side. I mean, most SLAP claims will be very difficult for a funder to consider funding, in part because they tend to look for injunctive or other types of relief, not damages or compensation, at least as their primary remedy. And obviously, if a funder is going to fund something, they need to work out how is the return of their capital and that agreed return going to be paid. So in most SLAP claims I've seen, the chances of that are remote, maybe not impossible, but remote, making it very difficult to fund it. I think from an Aristata point of view, again, depending on what the nature of the claim is, if political, we tend to avoid political issues for obvious reasons. And as you said at the beginning, Matt, it may not meet our, well, in that sense, social impact metrics anyway. So we would, I haven't actually been asked to fund a SLAP claim, but I suspect that we would find it challenging to do so.
I'll just come in on that briefly, Matt. I think to answer your question in terms of what you can do about it, I think that we are in an era now where there have been enough of this type of claim in most industries where a bit of research can be done about how the peer that is involved, in your peer group dealt with the claim, what they did, how they dealt with it publicly, how they dealt with it privately. Organizations could do a lot of learning actually from just looking at what's happened before. How did the reaction go in terms of media? How did the reaction go in terms of politics, in terms of shareholders, in terms of campaigners? How did that all play out in those? So for example, if you are BP, you can look at the Shell Client Earth situation and learn from it and try and work out what you would do if you were in that sort of situation. So I think, especially with organizations who have enough resource to put investment into working out what to do here, to effectively have a team of researchers on what do we do when X or Y comes up, I think that would be a pretty decent bit of advice. I think preparation is probably everything in that respect, because the last thing you want to do is to react in a knee-jerk way. That can really get you into a lot of bother. You've got to be able to take enough time to consider how to proceed, but not so much time that it looks like you're not on top of the situation, and therefore having as much research and preparatory work done in advance would probably be a pretty decent idea. But it is also where the particular point about external advice comes in. That's probably one of the most important things you can do in order to be adequately prepared for it and to not make the wrong decision quickly.
That's really interesting. And Jack, just another question that's come in, and it's actually not an uncommon question that you see in relation to litigation funding. Question around speculative claims and whether or not litigation funding in any way, I suppose, increases the likelihood of speculative claims being brought. I'm just interested in whether you have a view around, particularly in the ESG space, whether litigation funding could be seen as another reason why speculative claims are increasing.
I think it's a very good question, and as you say, Matt, it's a common concern raised. In my experience, I think litigation funding is almost the opposite, because certainly we and most litigation funders I know are not speculators. It is not a sort of venture capital type investment. And if you look at most published funders' information, they claim to be aiming to win between 85 and 90% of the cases that they fund. Now, that is completely the opposite to a call it old style US model, where if you win big on one and lose on 19, the one covers the 19. So I'm not saying that there isn't ever a funded case which might be viewed as speculative, but because the funder is seeking to make a return, in our case, also create positive impact, we are not looking to speculate by taking claims where the legal and commercial merits are very poor, because you're just not going to achieve anything. You're going to lose capital and not be able to fund meritorious claims as a result.
Absolutely. Another question that's come in, so what are the biggest barriers that prevent organisations viewing ESG as an opportunity instead of just being a cost? How can legal and comms help in reframing this? I think that probably comes back to a couple of the points we've touched on this morning. So from my perspective, from I guess a legal perspective, one of the things I would say in response to that is there's an opportunity in the sense that as the regulatory framework is continuing to evolve and continuing to introduce increased sanctions for non-compliance, the real opportunity here is getting ahead of the curve and putting in place the processes and procedures that you're going to need across the board in order to ensure that you are compliant, because it's the same with so many things in life, and actually taking that interventionist approach and dealing with a small issue at the outset rather than letting that run on to a point where it becomes unsustainable will save cost in the long run. And also, again, from the opportunity side of things, it is fundamentally important to so many people. It's an issue that people look at when they're looking at employment prospects. Investment is another huge issue. And again, I think Andy's already touched on that earlier in the presentation. The number of investors who have specific ESG criteria and the way that the world is moving is such that unless there is a proactive approach taken to these ESG criteria, you will start to lag behind competitors. And when it comes to things like procurement tenders and outside investment, businesses are going to really start to struggle to obtain that. Andy, I don't know if there's anything else from a PR.
Yeah, I think the other thing as well is, and you know, let me just be brutally frank about this. A lot of people who run organisations of all sizes are older, people like me in their 40s, who are probably just a little bit too old to be right on the cusp of where ESG is and where it's going, and where staff are and where activists are and where campaigners are and where other stakeholders are on this issue. There are a lot of people who run companies who don't believe in most aspects of ESG. They're not used to it. They don't have it in their corporate history. They may actively, in the case of the E part, for example, not believe in climate change. They're more likely to be skeptical about that sort of thing. And what we're always pretty frank with people about is to say, we're not trying to change your mind. Okay, you can go home and watch the news and make any judgment that you want on these environmental, social, and governance issues. That's up to you. But from a corporate perspective, from a business perspective, we're trying to encourage you to understand that this is not, we're not asking you to go net zero to be nice. We're not asking you to make banners and go on marches on a Saturday morning. That's actually not what we're doing. We're asking you to protect your business. This is a business issue. It's a business decision. It's not an environmental, a social, or a governance decision. It's a business decision. Because if you don't invest in these things, you are killing your profitability. Maybe not your short-term profitability, maybe not even your medium-term profitability, although I would argue you probably are, but certainly your long-term profitability is put at very significant risk if you do not invest in ESG. So I suppose the strap line to that would be, you don't have to believe in it, but you do have to do it.
Absolutely. One more for Jack. Just now. So I suppose the thrust of the question is, what is it that Aristata will do when it receives an application for funding? So how do you go about assessing a claim? What does it look like in terms of the process that you follow to decide, well, okay, we've received this claim, doesn't meet our criteria, and what are they? How do you go through that process?
Very good question. We tend to look at three main areas. So as I mentioned, our focus is firstly on, can we generate positive and measurable impact? So we have a objective data-driven impact assessment methodology developed with a group who used to be part of Bain called Bridgespan. And so we look on a first basis of, does this situation meet our impact metrics? If the answer to that is no, so what I might have done many years ago at Freshfields, pure company A against company B, no impact, we will say, thank you very much, looks an interesting claim, but it doesn't meet our impact metrics, therefore we cannot help. Assuming the situation, at least on an interim basis, meets those impact metrics, we will then look at the legal merits of the claimant's position. That's obviously the basis of the legal claim itself, the law firm who are involved, the strength of the team at that law firm, all of those issues that you would expect. What are the main issues that the law firms see in the claim? How are those issues going to be overcome? What is the strategy from getting from wherever the claim is now to that successful outcome? So that's the legal piece of it. And we have an external independent investment committee who have to also recommend the claim for investment. And then we look at the commercial pieces. So it may score strongly on impact, maybe a good legal claim, but if you just cannot make the numbers work, however creative and flexible, and we can be very flexible, then that becomes problematic as well. But assuming case has impact, has strong legal merits, and commercially we can see a situation where the claimants will receive the significant majority of whatever is recovered. It works for us as funder, it works for the law firm involved as well, who may have a conditional element to their fees. And if necessary, because you need adverse cost insurance, it works for the insurer, then that is how we go about assessing a claim. And it's very important to us that we can build that relationship both with the claimants or the claimant committee if it's a group and the law firm, because we see it very much as a three-part arrangement that needs to work for all three, not just for one or two. And so that relationship is very important because inevitably in a set of legal proceedings, you'll get to some points where there are difficult discussions and difficult decisions to be made. And so that alignment I mentioned at the beginning between law firm, claimant and funder is critical.
Absolutely, and having worked with a number of funders in the past, I definitely echo that. There are always those difficult conversations that need to take place at various stages along the litigation, and having that relationship makes a huge difference.
And if you've got a funder whose primary motivation is how much can I take out of this claim, then the people who suffer first tend to be the claimants, and secondly the law firm. And so that's why we focus very much on building that relationship, having that alignment, and therefore remaining all on the same page, whatever happens in the litigation, because it's all been discussed openly and transparently up front.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that comes from funding it touches on Andy's point around external advice is, a funder, because they understand these issues so intricately, they have that external input as well. And so whilst you can go to, a firm of solicitors, take external legal advice, there is something that is quite attractive and it's a value add in a lot of ways for the funder to look at something fresh and say, here are the issues as we see it. Have you thought about the various different considerations that may need to be taken into account based on our experience of dealing with a number of other similar claims? And that external advice piece, I think, is really important. I'm not seeing any other questions coming through, which means that we might be able to give everyone a little bit more time in their day back, which is always no bad thing. So unless there are any final questions, what I'm proposing to do is just close the webinar there. Just wanted to say thanks firstly to Andy and to Jack for agreeing to present today. I found it really useful. I think it's been really interesting to get these different perspectives on an area that is continuing to evolve, but I think it's continuing to grow as well, and it's one of these issues that isn't going to go away. Really interesting to hear from you, Jack, around how, from a claimant perspective, these claims are being dealt with, and thinking about how that might flow through to claims coming through in future, and really just the breadth of the different issues that are coming across your desk. And Andy, again, just thank you very much for, as always, providing such a useful summary of some of the things that we need to think about when these claims do come across our desk, and managing the reputational piece as well. So appreciate that all. Thank you everyone else for attending. I hope you found the session as useful as I did. We'll close the webinar there. And if you do have any other questions, I'm sure that any of us will be happy to pick them up separately offline afterwards. So feel free to reach out to the team at Shepherd and Wedderburn, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.